first question is, do you have in your house around you, with access to a battery or wind-up torch and radio? Whether you have a first aid kit available. And then the final question is whether you have enough, I think it's at least 3 litres of bottled water, bless you, whoever that was, and food enough for 3 days, non-perishable, and able to eat without having to heat it up. If you think back to when we used to all work in buildings, there's an issue of fire drills. Fire drills were great, weren't they? Because we generally worked out where we needed to be, what we needed to be doing, and we practiced, and it should generally go quite smoothly. And this is where we need to be with resilience. You know, we've got to be prepared enough so that when a crisis happens, we can operate really smoothly in the way that we try to with those fire drills. But so we've got to think about whether we've got those items. And if you look at it, that's what's on the Prepare website, the government's Prepare website, is to have battery wind-up torch, spare batteries, first aid kit, enough water, as we talked about, and hand sanitizer, wet wipes, etc. And having it somewhere isn't that easy. There are lots of reasons why we don't have it. Before you get to the psychological stuff, which I know that Dominic will look at in a minute. And if anybody was listening to Radio 4 at 1:30 yesterday afternoon, there was a really good programme which looked at the issues around prepping. That was Professor Lucy Stoke talking to a number of experts about the issues about it, why we don't need to do it, and getting into the mindset that we need to get to. And the other thing to think about, again, this is something that's come to the fore for me recently, is it's not just us, it's also children. So how are we talking to children about it? There's some interesting research that's just come out from a researcher who's doing a PhD at UCL. The other things you've got to think about in terms of resilience, 3 kind of important aspects for me, is understanding your risk and understanding what that means. And that includes physical, psychological, emotional, what is tied up with those situations that you have on your risk register or that are in mind. And what does that then mean for the planning that you've put in place? And it's yes, you need a plan, which I would hope everybody is saying, yeah, we've got one, but it's also the testing of it. And the testing of that plan, I think, needs more depth and more and much more comms in it, particularly when they are focused operationally. And ultimately, beyond that, is the consequences. And this is, for me, where resilience is really challenged at the minute, because we may have the risk element, we might understand that, we might understand the plan, but have we thought through misinformation and disinformation? Have we thought through all the challenges that we've got at the minute of the speed of how things operate? So that's where, for me, the consequences come in. And other things like the fact that you may respond in a particular way that then causes a knock-on consequence in another way. So those are the kind of key aspects. If you want to just spin the slide on for me again. So becoming resilient for me is all around risk awareness and early warning, and the 2 go hand in hand, because if you can't recognise the risks, you aren't going to be able to get the early warning situation in place. Any case study looking at particularly extreme weather will show you that where there are problems, it's usually, because there's a lack of trust, there's a lack of awareness around the risk levels, people just assuming various things. So we do need to get to understand the psychology and the emotion and what that means to our communication. And as we said at the start, that for me is one of the fundamental parts of it. Being comfortable as well with decision making under pressure, and that's the fire drill kind of situation. You repeat it and repeat it, it becomes muscle memory, and you are aware that there's no perfect crisis response or no perfect crisis communication. We have to make the best. We have to make decisions sometimes with very little clarity to achieve what we need to achieve. Having a plan, as I keep saying, because surprisingly, it still surprises me that there's still lots of businesses, organisations, and individuals and various people who just do not have a plan. In the same way, when we were talking about that poll before, I'm sure lots of you didn't have either in any of those items, even though we know we're supposed to be resilient. And everybody knows it. And then the final thing is the resilient goes in the different phases of a crisis as well. So you need to be the risk resilience, you need to be resilient when you're dealing with a crisis, but also you've got to think about resilience in terms of recovery as well. And we're not going to get to that because I'm going to well overdo my time if I'm not careful. So if you want to spin to the next slide, the other thing to think about, again, is these real decisions and real people. And this is where I think that understanding trauma, understanding psychology, understanding the disaster recovery graph, for anybody who understands that, with the emergency planning sort of side, is so important, because every decision we make has an impact. And when the Hillsborough Law, the Public Office Accountability Bill, becomes a law next year, that is going to have a big impact, I think, in terms of how we are approaching comms, how we are making our decisions, how we are challenging senior people potentially. And again, it's something I'm starting to kind of look at with teams as well, because it's a different kind of mindset in a certain extent, that we've got to make sure we are documenting things, and challenging at the same time, to make sure that we get where we need to be. Ultimately, we've got to stop being in a bubble when a crisis happens. We've got to look at it from the outside. We've got to understand how people are feeling, what's the mood. And things like, when you're doing your key points for somebody who's going to speak to the media, give them an understanding, give them tone points, get them get to really grasp how people are reacting to what's happened. And then finally, what does resilience look like? It looks like lots of different things to lots of different people. It looks like a really well-oiled room full of people doing things that they need to be doing, with lots of charts and things going all in the same place. It looks like having all those things at home, and lots of other things. Resilient individuals, resilient teams, resilient organisations, and then resilient communities. And there's a huge amount of UN work around resilient communities. Can you confidently answer what our plan is? You know what our plan is if a crisis or an emergency or a disaster happened tomorrow. So if you can confidently answer that, then that's brilliant. But it's a real challenge.